Mallory, if you can see this, text me, please. That's ridiculous. Not even the right one. You've got to be kidding me. Why does it say Odessa links? Whatever. All right, Mallory, if you can hear me, please text me. Testing. Is there anybody who can hear me? Bloody. Why can I get anybody to respond? I apologize for the technical difficulties. I don't know if anybody's in the room. I can't see the comments, so I'll just begin, and let's hope that there's somebody there who can benefit from this. This is as low tech as you can get. I am a survivor of suicide. My name is Reese Butler, and I am the founder of 1-800-SUICIDE. And if anyone watching this has lost a loved one to suicide or has any ideation of suicide or is triggered by anything in this presentation, please leave the session and call our hotline, 1-800-SUICIDE, 784-2433, or go online at imalive.org, and someone will be able to help you. So Kristen was my wife, who died by suicide 22 years ago, this last April. She was bipolar type 2 with a borderline personality disorder, but also suffered from obsessive compulsive disorder. And there was a family history of suicide. It turned out she was the fourth member of her family to die by suicide. She suffered severe postpartum depression after losing our baby in the second trimester. I am the one, not her, who should be dead. As you can see by this car crash, the pole on the left, I hit going about 70 miles an hour without a seatbelt. And on the right is what remains of the car. And as you can see by this slide, in the right-hand corner, big circle, that's where my head went through the windshield. And the little one on the left, that's where my head hit the hood. And of course, that's me over to the left. Not that you can see it very well. This was only one of many, many times that I should have died. She, on the other hand, wore seatbelts and was very careful about what she put in her body. She would never put anything harmful in her body. And yet she is the one who ended her life by suicide after suffering severe postpartum depression, which was improperly treated and became postpartum psychosis. Women who are bipolar type 1 or 2 are 35 times more likely to suffer severe postpartum depression. And if it is not treated properly, it can lead to psychosis. And in psychosis, especially with sleep deprivation, any one of us would have potentially auditory or visual hallucinations. She had both. As you can see by the date, well, maybe not because it's out of the screen range, but it was September 1997. And then the day that she was to have given birth, she had checked into a psychiatric care facility and ended her life on a suicide watch. What they call a suicide watch is uh, every 15 minutes they check on the patient to make sure they are still alive. It doesn't take 15 minutes to die. A month later, I received a check from her work at HealthNet for 1 year pay, which was an insurance benefit. I wasn't even aware they had. When I received the check, I looked for an organization I could donate the money to, and there was nothing regarding postpartum depression, nothing for women with postpartum psychosis. There wasn't anything going on for suicide prevention in any sector in America. And believe it or not, in 1998, there wasn't even a suicide hotline, toll-free suicide hotline that could be called from anywhere in the country. At that point, we had 1-800 bathtub, we had 1-800 flowers, of course, 1-800 plumber, 1-800 collect, you name it, but nothing for people in a psychiatric crisis. So I took the money from her insurance and started 1-800 Suicide, launched 6 months after her death, September 18th, 1998. A month later, I got invited to a conference in Reno, Nevada, which was developing a national strategy for suicide prevention so that our country, in fact, would start programs that could eventually help prevent suicide in the community. So I went to that conference, and I was a part of the authoring of the National Strategy for Suicide Prevention. And I got to meet the U.S. Surgeon General there, who declared in 1998, that's him in the bottom left, that suicide was the most preventable form of death in America. And I asked him to dedicate the National Suicide Hotline, 1-800 Suicide, and he agreed to the following May in Washington, D.C. And if you look over his right shoulder, or left as you look at the picture, that is Kristen in the poster behind, where it says #1 cause of suicide is untreated depression. No sooner did the dedication happen than I got a call from Tipper Gore's office. At the time, Al Gore was vice president, and Tipper had made mental health her #1 issue and had started the National Mental Health Awareness Campaign. And what they wanted to do was use our toll-free number in the advertisements that they were going to put out to MTV, Nickelodeon, VH1, the whole Viacom network. And I explained to them that they couldn't do that because we only had at that point 7 or 8 crisis centers that actually could answer the lines. And I explained to them that they would crash the system and nobody would be able to get help. So they asked me what I needed, and I told them we needed $150 million to certify crisis centers and provide them with the tools to raise the standards of their crisis center and have all of their volunteers and staff be trained independently and certified competent. And they laughed and said, well, we can't give you that much, but we can pay your phone bill, which was a good thing because at that point we were running out of money. And they said, well, we'll teach you how to get the money. I said, okay, I'm all ears. And they said, well, draft a piece of legislation that meets the need that you feel is necessary. find a friendly senator, and get him to sponsor it. So on May 10th, I got invited to another Washington, D.C. event, basically to fill a seat, wear a t-shirt, go rah, rah, rah. And I got there an hour early, mainly because I have ADHD, and uh, as a result, had the time wrong. But I looked in the room, it was totally empty. I said, well, what the heck? At least I'll get good seats. So I went and sat in the front of the room. And in walked Pete Domenici. That's him standing at the podium. And that's the late Senator Ted Kennedy on the right and the late Senator Paul Wellstone on the left. And Pete Domenici was the only U.S. Senator who sponsored and supported mental health legislation on a regular basis. He was our friend in Washington. I felt compelled to get up and go over and thank him on behalf of survivors, which is what we call ourselves, those who lose loved ones to suicide. And I went over and I introduced myself as the founder of 1-800-SUICIDE and thanked him on behalf of all survivors for the work he is doing. Shook his hand, went back down, and didn't think anything more of it. Well, when they were done with their dog and pony show, they started bringing up mental health consumers. And I guess whoever the next consumer was, wasn't moving fast enough for Pete. And so he looked at me, he says, "Are you the next speaker?" And I said, "But of course I am." And I got up to the podium. So I started talking about the very issue that 90% of crisis centers in America were not certified, and that less than 1% of the workers in those crisis centers had any independent level of training outside their crisis center. And I said we wouldn't allow our kids to go to a daycare center that didn't have some level of state certification. And with that, I got a standing ovation, and I went and sat back down. And the most important lesson I learned that day was that when you share your walk, your journey, your pain, your suffering, your story with others, it gives them permission in turn to share theirs with you. So Ted gets up and comes over and sits next to me, and he starts telling me how one of his dear friends, whose son was dying of a rare bone cancer, and Ted was paying for the treatments and the flights to the West Coast to receive them. And 2 weeks earlier, from that day, May 10th, his son had died, and the father, in his grief, shot and killed himself. And Ted was visibly upset about this and was sharing his grief and loss. And you remember that story about what Tipper Gore's people told me, find a friendly senator. So I pulled out the draft piece of legislation, I gave it to him, and he sat there, read all 3 pages. And when he got to the bottom of the 3rd page, he said, "Is that all you need?" And I said, "Yeah, to network and certify 200 crisis centers." And he said, "This is nothing. We waste more on lunches on Capitol Hill." And he said, "Most of what we do here is crap." He says, "Every once in a while we get to do something good." He said, "This is good." And so literally 6 weeks later, on June 28th, there's a congressional record where it talks about 1-800-SUICIDE and what the needs were. And the next slide shows you the actual amendment that Paul Wellstone and Ted Kennedy sponsored and got passed. Literally 6 weeks from the day I got up and had the impromptu speech in front of members of Congress, 6 weeks later, the bill passed by unanimous consent. And mind you, in the history of the United States, we had not had any funding for suicide prevention, certainly not direct services of any kind. And now, finally, we had funding. And all funding for suicide prevention that exists today, which is now almost $500 million per year, all came out of that first event and that first amendment to the labor HHS grant in 2000. So today we're going to go through a 1 hour, what we call gatekeeper training course. This one is called QPR, Question, Persuade, Refer. There's a bunch of them out there. Some of them are free. This one costs $30 online, and it takes an hour. And if you pass the test at the end, you get a certificate showing that you took the course and passed it. Hopefully, if you're a teacher, this could be continuing education or considered such. Everyone should know this. At this point, I normally would ask everybody who's listening, do you know CPR? And usually half the people in the room will raise their hands. And next thing I'll say is, well, how many of you ever used it? And usually only one or two hands go up. And I say, I bet you're a nurse or a lifeguard or EMT worker. And of course, they always are. And I said, the difference between QPR and CPR is not only is QPR easier to learn, but you actually get to use it today and every day of your life, because every one of us who's out there in the public see people that are depressed. We see people that their affect has changed, their demeanor's changed. So our goals here are to raise your awareness of the people that in fact might be at risk for suicide. And we do that by teaching you the warning signs. And these are the clinical warning signs that we have data and evidence to support. We also dispel the myths, which are the very things that stop most good-hearted people who want to help others, but are afraid to do the wrong thing. And we dispel the myths through data. Everything that I cover in this course, we have extensive bibliographies and citations that we're happy to share with you and give to you. So we teach you three simple basic things. One is how to question somebody that you're worried about, how to persuade that person once you found that they are indeed having ideation of suicide or have a plan for suicide. And the last thing is the referral part. Where do you take them? Where do you send them so that they are safe and you know you as a caring member of the community have done all you can do? And after that, you notice hope is all by itself on one line. And the reason for that is very simple. Hope is the most important ingredient that you can instill in a person who is suicidal. It's virtually impossible for somebody to die by suicide when you're hugging them. It's also very difficult for them to do it when they have hope, when they know there is a potential for things to get better. So any way that you can instill that hope, and we'll cover a number of ways that you can. The last piece is the resources. That's like the referral piece where you refer people to. That one is the most difficult, especially for the chronically suffering from a major mental health disorder. All right, so first we're going to deal with the facts. Approximately about 50,000 people in the US die every year by suicide. In reality, it's way greater than that if you include the drug overdoses that are suicides, which many of them are. We don't have data to support what percentage of the 50,000 deaths by overdose, opioids, heroin, and what have you. Also, single car, single occupant fatalities. They did a study back in 1994 showing that upwards of 70% of all single car, single occupant fatalities were indeed suicides. They did psychological autopsies on all the people that died in those single car, single occupant fatalities. When you add alcohol into that, and where a overdose or death by alcohol, which happens more frequently than most people realize, all those, if you add them in, we would be well above 200,000. But even at 50,000, it's you're going to see where it ranks in the order of reasons for death. So basically, about every 13 minutes, someone in the U.S. Dies by suicide. It leaves approximately six survivors, 6 of us loved ones. That's all we can show from the clinical data, but in reality, it's 10, 20, 30, 50. How many people did that person who died by suicide effect in a positive way, in a deep, meaningful way. It's considered to be the second leading cause of death among college students. It's also the third leading cause of death for all young people, and that's what we call 14 to 24. Suicide is the 10th ranking cause of death for all ages, and it's the fourth leading cause of death of all adults 18 to 65. And just take that in for a second. Fourth leading cause of death. And it's highest in white men over 45. It used to be over 65, but it's now dropped down to 45. What's interesting is and I always like to look at the correlations between the bad and the good. Who has the lowest rate of suicide in the United States? And of course, everybody always answers, babies, I mean, of adults. And that surprises almost everybody every time because it's not discussed and people don't know about it. But it is African American women across the lifespan. If you look at the stat, 19.75, or say basically 20 per 100,000, it's 1 per 100,000 for African American women. So why do white men over 45 die by suicide more frequently than any other group? And of course, if you put in Native Americans, where the data is not quite as solid, if you put in the LGBTQ community, if we really knew who they all were, I guarantee you that they would be number one in terms of the highest rate of suicide. But there's no accurate, conclusive data that I can point to, so it's the white men. All right, so basic reason why white men over 45 are the highest rate. It's because boys are raised not to cry, stuff their emotions down. So as adults, instead of reaching out and seeking help, they are stuffing their feelings down until they explode. African American women, there's only been 2 studies done ever. The first one was back in 2003. Dr. Carl Bell out of University of Illinois, Chicago, and Dr. Donna Holland Barnes. And the second study came out just a few months ago. And basically, what they came up with was African American women tend to have a circle of sisterhood that they're able to vent and share what's going on. They tend to have a strong faith connection. And lastly, but not leastly, they tend to be the breadwinner for the family. So they're depended on by their family members. And if you look at the white males over 45, it's usually divorce involved, loss of a job, no longer the breadwinner. Those are all risk factors that play into their high rate of suicide. So we should be screaming from the rooftops about African American women and their resiliency and their protective factors, and how we all could benefit from adding those into our own lives. In 2018, the rate across all of 300 million population was 14.2 per 100,000. Firearms account for more than half of all suicides, but when you break that down to men, it's over 70% of all suicides. And it's interesting, it's also over 70% that the suicide involves substance, whether it's alcohol or drugs, to lower inhibitions and impair the judgment. The last line here is about the AIDS epidemic. And at the peak of the epidemic from 79 to 2003, we lost 500,000 people from AIDS and HIV-related diseases. In that same time period, we lost over 750,000 people by suicide, and that doesn't account for the single car, single occupant fatalities and all the other areas that I discussed earlier. At the time 79, 2003, we spent billions and billions of dollars to develop um, treatments for HIV and educational programs, public health programs to combat it. And we did, and we were successful, obviously. And that was a good thing. And we should have. And we should have done it earlier than we did. In the same time period, we spent not a penny on suicide prevention. All right, research shows that in our lifetime, 20% of us will have a suicide within our immediate family, and 60% of us will personally know someone who dies by suicide. The whole idea behind taking this QPR course or any suicide prevention training course is to make sure if you do not have somebody in your family who's died by suicide, that also that never happens. So how do we do that? Well, first off, you have to recognize that up to 90% of people who die by suicide are suffering from one or more major health psychiatric disorders, such as major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, alcohol or substance abuse, schizophrenia, and personality disorders such as borderline personality disorder. And these are the most accurate of all studies because it involves a team of people who interview family, doctors, teachers, coaches, friends of the deceased. And so they're able to get a real accurate picture of what the person was suffering from before they died. All right, little guessing game. The bridge is 84 years old, considered an architectural marvel. There have been over 2,000 suicides off this bridge. 2 to 3 people per week are stopped. What bridge is this? Well, if you guessed the Golden Gate Bridge, you would have been right. And the reason why we have this in the slides is because the very first study that was done that proved you can prevent suicide was from 1937 when the bridge opened to 1970. 515 people that were restrained from jumping off the bridge were followed to the end of their lives. And what they found was that 5% did in fact go on to complete suicide, but that 95% that were restrained from jumping off the bridge did not go on to complete suicide. I mean, that is just remarkable. When you think about that period, 1937 and 1970, we had asylums. We didn't have community mental health centers until 1963, thanks to Ted Kennedy's older brother, John F. Kennedy, who we lost on November 23rd in Dallas. Anyway, 33 people actually survived jumping off the bridge, which is quite remarkable that they did. And 8 were followed up with those 2 years. And what they found was when they let go of the railing, they wished they hadn't done it. They wished they hadn't let go. Every one of them, 100%. And clearly no one swam to shore and jumped again. So what this means is people that are suicidal are in fact ambivalent. Almost all will choose life. What they don't know is how to do it. They don't have the knowledge, the access to the resources, the support that can help alleviate their pain and suffering and get them back on track. So they are ambivalent, and they clearly don't want to live anymore because they're in pain and suffering, but they also don't want to die. They just don't know any other choice. So it's all been narrowed down to this one single choice. Most people will say, after surviving a suicide attempt, my whole life is reborn. I can now sense other people's existence. It's quite remarkable. Now, of course, that it also involves getting the help and therapy that a person needs. Well, I did have a wonderful picture of the new bridge barrier, but This particular set of slides does not have it. So QPR is about asking a question to save a life. It is not intended to be a form of counseling or treatment. It's intended to offer hope through positive action. And almost any action that is positive that you do will, in fact, have a positive response from the person. We got to deal with the myths, because those are what usually stop most people from helping others who are, they think are at risk for suicide. And the first one is that no one can stop a suicide. It's one of the reasons why there was no funding for suicide prevention. What was the point in funding suicide prevention if you can't stop it? And the reality is, look at, the Golden Gate study, and we've got a lot of studies since then that show a much higher rate of efficacy. If people get the help that they need, people that are in a psychiatric crisis, if they get the help they need that is medicinal for them, they may never be suicidal again, especially if it's a situational or depression that is easily treated. Another myth: confronting a person, asking a person about suicide will only make them angry and increase the risk of suicide. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. Remember, we talked about the white males over 45 and how they're not reaching out for help. They could end up exploding. Well, when you ask somebody if they're thinking of ending their life, and you ask them in context, you look really depressed, I'm worried about you. What happens is you actually alleviate some of that stress. Letting them talk about it lowers their anxiety and their risk of suicide. So there's almost no wrong way to ask somebody, but we'll cover that a little bit later. Now, I love this myth: only experts can prevent suicide. And of course, when they say experts, they would have to mean professional mental health workers, psychiatrists, psychotherapists, MSWs. And in reality, none of those groups, other than the psychiatrists, are even given any training in suicide prevention. And psychiatrists receive only about 10 hours of training in suicide prevention, which shows you how ridiculous it is that we rely on experts to prevent suicide. As we like to say, suicide prevention is everybody's business, and anyone can help prevent suicide. In fact, it is the community, it is the friends, it is the family that is going to prevent suicide. Another stark statistic is every year we lose about 1,600 people to suicide in psychiatric care facilities like the one my wife was in, on a suicide watch. 1,600, 1,600. 100% of those suicides are preventable by having eyeballs on them 24/7. But it costs more to do that than to pay out a death benefit, which is usually a fraction of what would happen in a wrongful death case. All right, suicidal people keep their plans to themselves. In fact, most suicidal people communicate their attempt during the week or month preceding their attempt. Sometimes the communication isn't verbal. Sometimes it's something that they do, but we'll get into that later. Another myth is that people who talk about it repeatedly over and over and over again, they're really not at risk. They're not going to do it. They're just talking about it. It wasn't in the, I don't think it was in one of the earlier slides, but the reality is over 1 million people every year in the United States attempt suicide severely enough that requires hospitalization. You're looking at $10, $20, $30, $40,000 on average for each of those suicide attempts that require hospitalization. And then they patch them up and send them home. A lot of those people were people who talked about suicide and supposedly weren't going to do it. And just because they survived the suicide attempt doesn't mean we shouldn't prevent it in the first place. Because after attempting, now they have scars associated with it, psychological and physical. They have the costs associated with it, the embarrassment and so forth. So People who talk about it, they're not happy, they're not healthy, they're not living a rewarding life. Uh, if they're talking about it, then something's up, and it begs the question why. All right. Once a person decides to complete suicide, there's nothing anyone can do to stop them. Of course, we dispelled that with the Golden Gate study, and I'll cover the Henry Ford Health Foundation depression program, which had the highest rate of efficacy of any suicide prevention program ever in the history of mankind. All right. So how can you help? Well, by asking the question. And we're going to get you up to speed by giving you the clues and warning signs that we have clinical data to support. It's things that people say, it's things that people do, and it's the place that people find themselves in. And especially when you have clues from all three of those areas, the greater the risk. So you have to take all signs seriously. As I always like to say, err on the side of caution. All right. The way people tell it is pretty straightforward. Sometimes, I decided to kill myself. I wish I were dead. I'm going to die by suicide. I'm going to end it all. And at least if such and such doesn't happen by such and such date and time, you have a window of opportunity to help that person. The other ones, it's just a blanket statement. Sometimes they're not so blunt and direct. Sometimes it's things like, I'm tired of life, I just can't go on, or my family would be better off without me. And you think about those white males over 45, fear of becoming a burden to others, that they feel that their family would be better off without them. The sad part is they're taking their pain and suffering and they're passing it on to their family, who now are going to live with the consequences of the failure of the person who was ill or their loved ones around them to get that person the proper help they needed. So it's literally the exact opposite, that your family would be better off without you. Who cares if I'm dead anyway? I just want out. I won't be around here much longer. Pretty soon you won't have to worry about me. So anytime you hear anything like that, it begs the question, why? What's going on? Let's get a little deeper into that. All right. So the behavioral clues, things that people are doing, could be a previous suicide attempt. Now, remember, we talked about how if somebody gets the proper help and treatment, they may never be suicidal again. The reality is that most people don't. And most people who are released from the hospital or psychiatric care end up dying within 72 hours of their release if they didn't get the help that they needed, because they don't want to go back through that again. Once they've attempted suicide and survived, their inhibition for attempting again has been greatly lowered. Things like acquiring a gun, stockpiling pills, nothing wrong with owning a gun, but what's the reason? I remember in the month before Kristen's suicide, she asked me to take out a gun permit. And I asked the psychiatrist, I said, isn't that a warning sign? And he said that it wasn't a red flag or a warning sign, which is really a shame because it clearly was. I would say he was incompetent, but he didn't have the training that was necessary, so he would know that that was a risk factor. Anytime you have co-occurring depression, moodiness, and hopelessness, you get those three together, that is a lethal combination. Putting personal affairs in order. Nothing wrong with that. Everybody should, right? But if they're doing it out of context, there's no reason for it, it begs the question, why? Why now? A very common one, especially amongst young people, is giving away prized possessions. I remember in the months leading up to Kristen's death, she was making these really wonderful, soothing water fountains and giving them to our friends. Never did that before. That was a warning sign. I didn't know it. Sudden interest or disinterest in religion. And you notice we cover both ends of it. Why? Because we're looking for behavioral changes. You're looking for abrupt changes. If somebody was really clean and well kept, and then all of a sudden they're disheveled, or the opposite. They used to be, pretty messed up, lazy, whatever. Now all of a sudden they're tidy and clean. You're looking for behavioral changes. What is causing it? And maybe something really positive. Uh, you know, maybe they found a newfound faith in a particular religion, or if they've fallen away from their religion. That's a huge risk factor, because staying with uh, the faith that they had is a protective factor. Remember the African American women across the lifespan. All right. Drug or alcohol abuse or relapse after a period of recovery certainly is a major risk, mainly because the alcohol and substance can lower the inhibitions, and therefore allow the person to do something that they would not do in any otherwise state. Last one, unexplained anger, aggression, irritability. Again, you look at those white males over 45. Men do not show depression the way women do. Women tend to show depression, sobbing, crying, withdrawing, sleeping a lot. Where men, it's outbursts of anger, which is, people don't regard as depression, which is sad, because that is the warning sign. Like, why are they angry? What are they angry about? No, we just want to arrest them. And of course, you add alcohol in. It's a horrible combination. All right. We're looking for the situational clues. Somebody loses a job, gets fired, they get expelled from school, their whole career track has been derailed. That's a major event in a person's life, and it's a major red flag. It doesn't mean they're suicidal. What it means is somebody who has experienced that is at greater risk, especially if you have all these other things going on comorbidly. Recent unwanted move. It could be a good move for the person, but just change itself, again, abrupt change is in itself a risk factor. I remember the month before Kristen died, we bought our first house together. And 2 weeks before she went into the psychiatric care facility, she and I closed on the house. She never got to see the inside of it. Any loss of a major relationship, especially for young people, they don't have the perspective of time and history. Death of a spouse or child or best friend, especially if it's by suicide. Us who lose a loved one to suicide are 9 times greater at risk to die by suicide. Diagnosis of a serious or terminal illness. Now, if you knew somebody who died of a horrible, terrible illness, if you probably remember, they probably fought for every day of their lives. But in that first 36 to 72 hours, when they got the diagnosis, that's when their moorings are cut. That's when they're at greatest risk, because they want to regain control of their life and the end of their life. The same happens with sudden, unexpected loss of freedom or fear of punishment. In all of the jails and prisons in New York State, they have a system in place where when someone is first jailed, they have a careful watch on them for the first 3 days. When they get sentenced, when they get arraigned, that's a red flag. When family members are supposed to come and visit them and don't show up, that's a red flag. So when those things happen to an inmate or a prisoner, that's when their antennae go up. Loss of a cherished therapist, counselor, teacher. You think about it. How difficult is it to find a doctor you trust, period? How difficult is it to find a decent car mechanic, right? Who's honest and does a good job? Well, finding a therapist that you're going to share your deepest, most innermost, darkest secrets, your pain, your suffering, putting yourself in a vulnerable state, it can take up to 2 years for a patient to trust the therapist. Up to 2 years it could take. So imagine after going through that whole process and finally being able to trust your therapist, and then bam, they move or change their practice. I remember Kristen had finally found a really good therapist she'd been seeing for about 2 years, and 3 months before her death, he left the private practice and joined the VA. It was a boon for the VA, and it was a huge burden loss to Kristen. And she just had every warning sign there was. If I had had this course, she would be alive today, and I believe that. Fear of becoming a burden to others. That's that white males over 45 again. All right. So you've seen all these behavioral and situational and verbal clues and so forth. You're worried. As we say, if you're in doubt, don't wait, ask the question. And it really doesn't matter how you ask, other than I'm going to show you in a minute how not to ask. It's just important that you do. The only caveat to that is if you are not comfortable with asking, even after taking this 1-hour course, then get somebody who is comfortable, because there may be only one window of opportunity. And if you are nervous and uneasy in asking, that person may not want to burden you, and therefore not be as direct and honest as they would be with somebody who had confidence asking that. But if you're confident and you're ready to ask, make sure you talk to them in a private setting. Give yourself plenty of time. Please don't wear a watch or take it off. And if they're reluctant, be persistent. And most importantly, allow them to do the talking. Your job is to listen, not pass judgment, not give them advice, not tell them what to do. Just let them vent. And through their venting, they will probably figure out what they need to do, believe it or not. But just in case they're not, make sure you have your resources handy, such as the suicide hotline. We're going to cover that at the end here. Hopefully you know the name of their counselor, or you have access to one. Any place that you can take them where they'll be safe. All right, like I say, how you ask it is less important than the fact that you ask it. All right, most people like the less direct approach. Have you been unhappy lately? Have you been very unhappy lately? Have you been so very unhappy lately that you've been thinking about ending your life? At least that's in context. You don't want to ask somebody if they're suicidal if there's no reason for it. In other words, you saw a warning sign, you heard something, or they're in a situation. You say, wow, when somebody is in the situation you're in, they might be thinking of killing themselves. Are you thinking of killing yourself? Straight up, The most softball approach is, do you ever wish you could go to sleep and never wake up? I like the direct approach because people are not prepared for it. They won't have an answer prepared. And if you ask them directly and honestly, straight up, you look pretty miserable. I wonder if you're thinking about suicide. Are you thinking about killing yourself? And then what is the context for that? So, as I say, if you don't feel comfortable, then find somebody who can. This is about the only way not to ask the question. You're not suicidal, are you? You're not crazy enough to do something like that, are you? And the reason behind it is pretty simple. Obviously, you give them the ability to be let off the hook. All right. So they've told you that they're suicidal. They've aired all of their issues somewhat. Make sure you've listened and paid attention to what they're saying. especially if they start rambling and repeating themselves and saying things that contradict things that they've been saying. They could be at that point, um, in uh, uh, psychotic state severe enough that they need immediate hospitalization. Uh, if you can come up with a phrase that you're comfortable with, a lot of people like, suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. Uh, Whatever works for you. It doesn't have to be that one. It's got to be genuine from your end, but not one that is a judgmental one. Mainly, you want to offer hope in any form. Now, somebody who has never been suicidal before, it's pretty easy to offer hope. It's like, this too will pass. I'm going to stick with you. You're not alone anymore. Things like that. We'll get through this together. That in itself is a form of hope. Now, somebody who has been chronically depressed or suffering from any of the major mental health disorders chronically all their lives, that's real difficult to offer hope. But that is where we do things like ask them if they've tried the vagus nerve implant yet. Because they'll say, I've tried everything. I've tried every drug therapy. I've tried talk therapy. Nothing works. I say, have you tried the vagus nerve implant yet? They'll say, what's that? I say, well, the company that developed it 15 years ago spent $1 billion to bring it to market. The first recipient was Charlie Donovan, who wrote the book Out of the Black Hole. You can get it on Amazon for like $3 or $4. It's a great book. And it's basically a copper wire that goes into the back of the skull into the vagus nerve, and on the chest is a little button they can tap to send an electrical impulse, which creates happy thoughts. Another one that I tell people about that has shown a lot of promise is the magnetic resonancy, MRIs or fMRIs. They did a study years back on bipolar patients, and they would go in whatever their state was, depressed, and they come out all happy. They're like, what the heck? We didn't give them any treatment. We didn't give them any drugs. And what they found was that the actual zapping of their brains with the magnetic resonance stimulated the dead parts of the inactive parts of their brain. And so now they're using targeted MRIs to provide treatment for people who otherwise drug treatment never worked for them, talk therapy never worked. So that's how I offer hope. And also, this is the holy grail. Any company that comes up with a treatment that works for a large percentage of the population that suffers from depression, we're not talking $1 billion product. We're talking $1 trillion product. So persuading them, not too difficult. Basically, will they go with you to get help? Where is that? What worked for that person before? Your willingness to listen to them and help can rekindle hope. It can make all the difference in the world. You may be the first person who's asked them, the first person who's shown them any empathy. The promising, I'm not a big fan of that, just because once they're out of your sight, whatever state they're in, they may not even remember the promise. So you stick with them until they get the help that they need. That's my prescription. And that's the referral. That's the piece that is the toughest one. If they have tried everything, they are chronically suffering from a major mental health disorder. If you've got in your town, city, a major hospital, MRIs for battling depression and bipolar disorder and other major mental health disorders is becoming more routine and even paid for by many insurances. So doing some research in advance based on what the person's illness is, finding what are the best resources in your community. That's what I would want to go into the conversation with the person and say, hey, let's go try this. You haven't tried this before. Let's go together. Of course, No, none of us can be with somebody 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So even though you say I'm on your side, we'll get through this, and you're sticking with them, you're hugging them, uh, at some point you got to go to sleep. At some point you got to go back to your family. So you got to make sure you get others involved. Find out from the person who else they might trust or do trust. Maybe a family member is the reason why they're in the condition they're in. So it may not be a family member. Maybe there is a family member that they can trust, a pastor or a rabbi, a bishop, any other friends, coach, teacher, anybody else that they can bring into the circle. I highly recommend, because not not creating a team, not joining a team, it becomes all on you, and that's not fair. And nobody can do that. So make sure that when you help put that team together with your friend, your loved one, that everybody signs a, a release, and allows the physician, the mental health professional, to communicate freely without penalty based on whatever your state laws are. Um, we don't want people falling through the cracks, and that's what happens if you don't have agreements in place with each of the people that have agreed to be part of that team. Also, make sure you follow up, with a visit, phone call, send a note, especially if you're in a different city and so forth. Continuing to show that you care in itself may save a life. So, as we love to say, when you apply QPR, you plant the seeds of hope, and hope helps prevent suicide. As a call to action, 51 years ago, John F. Kennedy said, we're going to put a man on. I mean, no, 51 years ago we put a man on the moon, but 61 years ago he said we're going to put a man on the moon. And anytime somebody says we can't do something, I always say, wait, we put a man on the moon. Why can't we do that? They finally eliminated suicide in an entire uh, uh, health foundation community. It was in Detroit, of all places. The rate of suicide was 80 per 100,000, 4 times greater than the white males over 45, right? And what they did was they trained every single one of the people who worked or touched a patient. And they eliminated suicide for 14 straight quarters. That's 3.5 years. It's written up in JAMA, the American Medical Association. So we can do it in every community in the U.S. Why not? Why not do it here? And here are your resources. Obviously, the National Suicide Hotline, 211, generally rings into the local crisis center, and I'mAlive.org. Thank you for sitting through this, and go to qprinstitute.com, and you can take this course there and take the test at the end. And Paul Quinnett, the founder of the Institute, will send you a certificate showing that you've learned this information. And I think we're done.